Hello, wildlings. I'm your Creepsmith, and you found my Fear Forge. Lucky you. Tonight's story, Candlewalker, by Shadowscribe. I didn't particularly like this room. It was dark and empty. A spare room that I hadn't had the chance to do anything with. The electricity had gone out sometime earlier that night, so I had no way to tell time and no source of light except for the flashlight in my hand, my lighter, and the candle that I'd brought just in case. I was sitting with my back in the far corner of the room, the flashlight pointed straight at the door on the far wall. The beam of light danced on the wall across from me as my hands shook, terrified, although I had no idea what had been stalking me that day. It started as I was coming back to the old house from the store. I didn't have a care, so I biked, carrying my groceries in 2 plastic bags in a crate hooked up to the rear of the bike. When I got home, I noticed that I was missing a bag of groceries. Must have fallen off when I was riding. Thinking it nothing more than unfortunate luck, I picked up the one remaining bag and headed inside. After all, I could do without canned goods for a few days. I opened the door and almost immediately tripped on something piled in a heap at the foot of my door just inside the house. The groceries from the bag I was holding flew into the air and scattered as I hit the ground. When I looked back to see what had tripped me, there was a sloppy pile of canned food. Since I never locked my door, I simply dismissed it as a good Samaritan act from somebody who lived in the area and was too shy to introduce themselves. I picked up all the food and stowed it away in the kitchen. It was getting to be about nighttime, so I headed upstairs to my bedroom, got a good book, flipped the switch on the bedside lamp, and entrenched myself in a story. As the night went on, I started to hear weird noises coming from the downstairs kitchen. I told myself it was just my imagination because every time I'd notice the sounds, they would stop. And when I went back to the story, they'd pick up again. My imagination would do that to me from time to time. Before I was able to finish my chapter, the lamplight flickered out. I put my book down, still open and pages down to save my spot, and went to turn on the light. Unfortunately, that didn't come on either. It seemed the power was out. As I tried to remember where the circuit breaker was, the noises from downstairs resumed. It sounded like someone was rummaging around in my kitchen. I grabbed a flashlight from the nightstand drawer, my bat from underneath my bed, and headed downstairs, each of the steps creaking on my way down. When I got to the kitchen, the noises stopped. Bat ready, I pointed my flashlight all around to see where the intruder was, but I didn't see anyone. What I did see was the canned food that I'd recently put away was stacked neatly, pyramid fashion, just beneath the kitchen table. I swallowed hard, thinking that someone was either playing some prank or some sick, twisted game. Slowly, I crept toward the table, feet wet from orange juice and milk that had been spilled on the floor. When I got close to the table, I could hear breathing from beneath it. I stooped down to look, but saw nothing. Then, slowly, I reached out to touch the pyramid of cans, and as soon as my hand made contact, the cans scattered. It was as if something had burst through them, scattering them in all directions. I fell back onto the soaked floor and dropped the flashlight. As I frantically grasped for the light, I heard feet splashing through the puddles on the floor and running out of my kitchen. I got up and slowly followed the footprints made of juice and milk. What struck me as odd was that they didn't look like human footprints. They were the same width and length, but the toes were much longer, almost as long as fingers. I followed them towards the front door, where they disappeared. I relaxed a little, just thankful that whatever it was gone, but I didn't loosen my grip on the bat. Slowly, I walked backwards towards the stairs again, planning on locking myself up in my room and waiting until morning. As I did, it sounded like something wet hit the wooden floor in front of me. I pointed my flashlight down at the floor and my heart stopped. There was a new footprint. Right there, pointing right at me. I took a step back. Another wet slap. Another footprint. I turned and ran, tripping up the stairs but making it to my room. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and pushed the bed up against it, knocking my book down in the process. I set the bat down on the bed for a second and grabbed my lighter and candle out of my nightstand, just in case I'd need it. That's when I heard the first squeak. Whatever it was mounting the first step in the staircase. Frantically, I ran to the opposite side of the room, where there was a door that led to my spare room. Upon hearing the second step creak, I threw open the door, which didn't have a lock, and ran inside, heading to the far corner. I sat there, quietly, breathing heavily, heart pounding in my ears. I realized only then that I'd left my bat on the bed, but I was convinced by the creaking of the third and fourth step that it wasn't worth going out to get it. And I sat there, counting the steps as they creaked. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It was getting much closer. My hands shook as a tear ran down my cheek. What the hell was going on? 15, 16, 17... I tried to control my breathing. After all, I was trying not to be found. 19, 20, 21. My heart pounded louder, sweat flattened my hair to my head, and the shaking became worse. 22, 23, 24. My knuckles were white as I clenched the flashlight, whose beam was now dancing all over the wall and rarely landing on the door. 25. It had reached the second floor. Slowly, the footsteps got closer as it approached my room. I heard the lock turn, the door creep open, and the bed scrape across the floor. I heard the bat rattle against the wood as it fell off the bed, and still the footsteps continued. Pages turned as whatever it was picked up my book and leafed through it. Then came a sudden thud as it dropped it. I began rummaging through my drawers and my sheets, looking for something to defend myself with. Then everything went still and quiet. The silence was broken only by my quiet sobs and heavy breathing and the pounding of my heart. It stayed like this for what seemed like a few minutes, and the footsteps continued, closing the distance between it and the spare room. The door slowly creaked open, lingering ajar momentarily. My heart was ready to leap out of my chest. My mouth was dry, and sweat stuck my clothes to my skin. Oh, this was it, I thought. As I waited for something to come into the room, well, nothing happened. Again came the excruciating silence, this time lasting for what felt like hours on end. Nothing happened, and I was starting to believe that whatever it was had lost interest and left. Still, I sat in my corner, flashlight trained on the door opposite me, slowly returning to a calmer state of mind. And after God knows how long, my flashlight flickered out, leaving me in complete darkness. Frantically, I reached for the lighter and flicked it on. My gaze shot towards the door. Still nothing. I looked around the room. Nothing here either. Slowly, I got up and crossed the room to the door. I closed it and sat with my back against it just in case. And still, the silence reigned. Finally, I let out a sigh of relief. It was gone. It had to be. I went to flip the switch, but the power was still out, so I lit the candle instead. And that's when I became aware of something standing in the opposite corner of the room. My heart froze in my chest and my lungs refused to work. It hadn't been there before, but it was there now. In a frenzy to get up and run, I knocked the candle over and it went out. I gripped the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. I was stuck, locked in here with God knows what this was. I stooped and searched the floor for the lighter, flicked it on, looked around, but the being was gone. Again, I was alone. Breathing heavily, I found the candle, all the while keeping my gaze on the far corner where the thing had been just moments before. Once I brought the lighter to the wick, and life was breathed into the candle, it reappeared in the far corner, exactly as it had been before. It was the candle that gave it away. The first thing I noticed were its feet. Flat, long, bony. Its body was built just the same way, abnormally skinny like a Holocaust victim, just skin wrapped in bone. It was short, too, like a child. It only came up to my waist, if that. Its knobby arms were just long enough that its skinny fingers reached the ground as it stood straight up. It wore the remains of a tattered old gray cloak draped over its shoulders. But its face was something that is beyond words to describe. As best I can, it was bald, pale, had no ears or nose that I could see. The mouth was thin and lacked proportion, much like the rest of the body. And the eyes were round, lifeless black orbs that simply reflected the candlelight. As I stared at it, its eyes seemed to calm me down. My heart rate slowed, my breathing steadied, and the urge to run away faded. Something about its eyes kept me gazing into them, unable to move, not wanting to if I could. I began to realize that it had been following me for quite some time, not just since the grocery store, but it had been there when I was a child, watching me. It had been waiting for me. It had followed me since then, and it had a purpose for me. I could feel its gaze drawing me in, helping me realize that I belonged with it. It stepped forward, slowly putting one foot in front of the other, dragging its fingers across the ground. It came up right next to me, its gaze never leaving mine, and as I stared down at it, and it up at me, slowly it raised one arm, holding out its long, thin hand. Its fingers were about twice the size of mine, and I knew that normally this would be something to be afraid of, but as I gazed into the light reflected off its eyes, I began to forget my own name, my entire past, and my whole self. I looked at the hand, and it patted mine with its other hand. It looked at the candle and led me out the door, down the stairs, out into the yard. Together we walked down the street and up to the forest, the candle lighting our path. I stopped at the edge of the woods and looked back at the city. The creature tugged on my arm, insistent that I followed. I looked back at it. It turned and I looked into its eyes, and all of the worries were gone. Somehow, I knew that I had to hurry because the others were waiting. I wasn't the first one that he'd found, nor would I be the last. I was going to join the others. We kept on walking, following the path that it led me down, lit by a mixture of candlelight and moonlight. As we strode, the wind picked up and the candle was blown out. It dropped to the forest floor with a thud. I looked around frantically for my guide, but he had disappeared. Still, there was the grip on my hand, pulling me down the path, lit by moonlight. No one would ever see me again. Well, at least it's good to feel wanted. Stay scary, my wildlings, and make the most of your nights.